In this video, we're going to learn how to use a string grid. First of all, what is a string grid? How do we add one to our form? How do we set it up? And then how do we use it to display our 2D arrays? So before we begin, as I just mentioned, that's the point of a string grid. It is a nice table-like grid that is in the same structure as a 2D array with columns and rows. So if you ever would like to display the complete contents of your 2D array in columns and rows, a string grid is your go-to component in order to do that. So let's add one to our form. Now, this form is a continuation from the previous video, an introduction and the basics of 2D arrays. So if you want to know more about this program, you can watch that video. We're just going to add on to it. So I'm going to make my form a little bit bigger. And here by my palette, I'm going to search for T-string. Right, T-string grid, there we have it. T-string grid is found under additional, if you'd like to find it that way. Let's add it over here. There we go. So that's my string grid. You can see immediately we have columns, we have rows, and it's in like a cell structure where there's different blocks for different pieces of information, just like our 2D array looks like. Now the first thing we should do is give it a name. So let's do that. We'll use the prefix stg for string grid, and I'll just call it output. There we go. Now the second step is to make sure that our string grid matches the size of our array. So our array, here it is, we have 5 rows and we have 3 columns. Okay, if you remember from the previous video, we used chars to label our columns, but that doesn't really change anything. We have 5 rows and we have 3 columns. So let's adjust our string grid accordingly. Now to do that, we're going to start with our columns. We look for a property called col count or column count. It's set with a default of 5. We're going to, if we say 3, because we know we've got 3 columns in our array, we get 3 columns. But now with a string grid, the first column and the first row, not sure if you can see, it looks like it's almost bolded compared to the rest of them. That's because the first column and the first row is used for headings. So we'll need to add another column, let's make that 4, so that we have the first column for the headings of the rows, and then we have 3 extra columns for our data. So if our array has 3 columns, our string grid will have 4, 1 for headings. Same with the row. So to adjust the row, we're going to go down to row count. There we go. And it's on 5 by default. We need 5 rows because we have, or what we're trying to do, remember, is we are capturing the attendance for grade 8s, 9s, and 10s, 11s, and 12s. So that's 5 grades. So we have 5 rows, but the first row is not really made for data. We could technically put data there, but we want to keep it for headings. So we need another 5 rows. We only have 4, so we're going to adjust this to make it 6 in total. 1 row for headings, the headings of the columns, and another 5 rows for our data. Good. Now our string grid matches our array, so we can adjust it. Now we can adjust our form because it's the correct size. And we can move on to actually using it to display data. Now, I'm going to use the Show Totals button, which in the previous video we used to display the number of students per grade. But we'll use the same button to display the complete contents per grade and per class, how many students in each class on the string grid. So we go down, I've made another heading here, display array in string grid, and we'll do our code underneath. Now, an array has rows and columns. and a string grid also has rows and columns. So if we use a nested for loop to display into an array or read from a 2D array, we will also need a nested for loop to display in a string grid. One for the rows and one for the columns. Again, this is not actually that difficult because if you've gotten used to doing it for arrays, it's the exact same thing, almost. It's just one little difference, which I'll explain in a bit. So we already have a variable for I row, and we already have a variable for C col because our column was A, B, and C. So let's go ahead and set up that nested for loop. Again, you're basically copying and pasting what you did up there. But I'm not going to copy and paste. I'm going to do it from scratch because since we're new to string grids, we have to practice a long way in the beginning to get used to it. So I'm still going to keep track of my begins and my ends. And I'm going to make sure to indent my code properly so that it is easy to read. For C col, A to C do. Perfect. Good. So our nested for loop is set up, and we can now go ahead and display in our string grid. So because we're displaying in the string grid, we start by writing out the string grid's name, which is stg output dot cells. Okay. So we are dealing with cells here. You can see they look like little blocks. They are indeed cells. So cells, what cell are we dealing with? Just like the array over here, where we specify the name of the array and then the row and the column. Here in the string grid, we also have to specify a row and a column. But here's the one difference that I had mentioned just a few seconds back. It's the opposite way around for a string grid. Okay, the developers of Delphi couldn't let things remain so simple for you guys. They had to switch something around. So here they switched the column and the row around. So if a 2D array, you always specify the row first, then the column. It's the opposite way around for a string grid. So first the column, which in this case is C col, and then I row. All right, I think that's easy to remember. Again, if you remember that the array is first the row, then the column, you'll know instantly that the string grid is the opposite way around. Now, there's one extra thing, and this is more of a situational thing. We used chars, A to C, to provide headings for our columns in our array, and that's 100% fine. Right? In this case, it's actually really good because it keeps track of class A, B, and C. The thing is, with string grids, you can't use chars to label rows or columns. It has to be an integer all the way. So what do we do now? Because now our inside loop is not 1 to 3, it's A to C. So we can't say C col. It's not going to work. It's really telling us that there's an error over here because it's looking for an integer, not a char. So we'll have to improvise. We'll have to make a little bit of a change here. Well, not a change, we'll have to add something. I'm going to go here to, where is the beginning of this? I'm going to add I col as an integer. And what we're going to do is, when our C col goes A, B, and C, we're going to have I col, which is going to be 1, 2, or 3. So I will increment I col. I col will be starting at 0. And when C col becomes A, we're going to increment this guy, and he's going to become 1. And so over here, instead of saying C col, we'll say I col. All right? When C col becomes B, this will increment again, and it will become 2. So now we're dealing with column number 2. And when this C col becomes C, this guy will increment again for the last time, and I col will then be 3. So it's the exact same thing, right? 3 is C and C is 3. It's just that the string grid doesn't want a char it must be an integer. And so we're just giving a integer version of our C. Again, this is not something you have to do every time. This is only if you use a char to label your rows or your columns in the array. And that's what we did this time, so we have to implement that. Now, of course, this guy must never become 4. So icol must be reset to 0 for each row. So for row 1, icol is 0. Then when we get here, it becomes 1, 2, 3. When we go to the next row again, we start from row number 2. Icol becomes 0 again, so that we can start with 1, 2, and 3 again, and so on and so forth. Let me add my semicolon. All right, now that we've got that sorted out, we can continue. So stg output.cells, we've specified the column and the row the opposite way around from the array, and that's going to be equal to our array. Now, our array is an integer. We declared it as an integer, and this is a string grid. Okay, it literally has the word string in the name. So yes, we have to convert it to a string to display inside of a string grid. So into string arr2att, we will be looking at the row first. As always, I told you it doesn't change, and I didn't lie, it doesn't change. When we work with an array, you first specify the row, then the column. Okay, and we will be using ccol because yes, when we declared our array over here, we declared it with chars to label the columns, column A, B, and C. So we will say ccol over there. And that's it. This will now display the contents, all the contents of the 2D array in the string grid. If this is the first time you're looking at it, it will look perhaps intimidating or a bit confusing. But the structure of this nested for loop is exactly the same as this one that we used to display the last video. It's exactly the same as the one we used to read the initial data into the 2D array in the first place. So it doesn't even change. You remember it, and it's the same. All right? The only thing we have to remember here is that, yes, the string grid is not row first, it's column first. It's the opposite of the array. Practice this 3 times. Even if you do this exact same example 3 times over, write it out on a piece of paper if you want to, or use 3 different exercises, whatever. On the 3rd time, once you've done this 3 times, it's in your head, you remember it, it becomes easy. It becomes 3 marks in an exam. Practice, practice, practice is the motto of IT. All right, so this will display the contents of the array in the string grid. Before we try it out, we need to set up the headings. So the contents of the array is displayed over here, but the headings, we still need to do that. So let's do it then. In show totals, just above where I display this, I will set the headings now. So we're not going to use a nested for loop to do this. We will use a loop because we're going to do 1 column at a time and 1 row at a time. 1 at a time. Okay, so let's start with 1. For I, let's just use I, why not? From 1 to 5, do. So we'll be setting up the headings for the rows now because we know there's 5 rows. So let's do that first. stg output.cells. Now we must first specify what, even though we're going to be working with the same column, it's the first column over here. That's not going to change because this is where the headings are. We still need to specify. And what column do you suppose that is? Is it column 1? No, it's column 0. Column 1 starts over here. That's column 1, 2, 3, right? The first column starts at 0. The same with the row. The first row is row 0. So that's not going to change, which is why we can hard code it as 0. But what is going to change is the row starting at 1. You see our for loop starts at 1 over here. Yes, we will be starting at the second row, which is actually row number 1, because the first row here is going to be used later to give the headings for the columns. So row 1 is that one, and it goes until row number 5, which is actually the 6th row, but we start counting from 0. So it's row number 5. And we will say, right, we can say whatever we want here, really. Grade okay, what grade are we dealing with? I need a counter to go from up, 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 up. But of course, we're not dealing with grade 1. So I'm going to say I plus 7. That's going to give us grade 8. And when I becomes 2, it will be 2 plus 7, which will give us grade 9, and so on and so forth until the 12th grade. That's the headings for the first column done, which means our rows now have headings. So we'll use the same for loop or the same integer, just reuse I, no problem. And that's going to be counting from 1 to 3. Why? Because we have 3 columns that need headings. I'm not going to use A, B, and C because I told you that the string grid needs integers. stg output dot cells. The column comes first. What column? We're dealing with columns. The columns are changing, so it's going to be column 1, 2, and 3. Yes, we will label them as A, B, and C in a minute, but it's column 1, column 2, column 3. We can't use chars to label the columns in a string grid. So that will be I, because it's going to go from 1 to 3. However, we will be sticking with row 0, which is the first row, so we will hard code that as a 0, because we just want to fill that row. So we will be saying class plus. Now, I don't want to say class 1, 2, and 3, so I can't use I. I want to say class A, B, and C. So again, I'm going to make an adjustment here. I'm going to use the variable that we already have, ccol. I know we already have a ccol, which is a char, and I'm going to initially set it to be A. And I will say ccol. So now it's going to say class A. And to change it to B, we will increment ccol. If you didn't know this or you've forgotten, we can increment a char. It will just become B. And then the third time it increments, it will become C. All right? So that will be first class A. Then for the second column, it will be class B. And for the third column, it will be class C. And that's it, we're done. This is the code. We'll test it now in a minute. Just one more disclaimer. If you are worried that ccol, setting it to A, is going to mess with our ccol over here, it won't, because this will initialize ccol back to A for the loop. That's just in case you were wondering that. If you weren't, no sweat. Let's give it a try. So let's use some real data here. Now we're starting again from class 8A. We're going to fill our entire array. So 34, 35, 31, grade 9 class A. There's 33 for class A, 34 for class B, and 37. Let's speed it up. 35, 34, 33 for grade 11, 29, 31, 31. And finally, grade 12. For class A, we have 28. We have 30 and 29 for class C. So our array, our 2D array, is now filled. We can go ahead and click on Show Totals. There we go. This is from the previous video where we added up the number of students per grade, so we'll ignore that. Here's our string grid, and let's have a look. We can see our labels are looking nice and clean. Grade 8 to grade 12, right? That's what we did over here, where we said grade into string I, which was starting at 1, plus 7 to give us 8, and it added up until 12. Then class A, B, and C instead of class 1, 2, and 3. Over here, we said class C, and we did that adjustment over there. And this is the contents of our array. As we entered them and we filled the 2D array, we now displayed the entire 2D array in a column and row format in our string grid. Very nice, very clean. And that's it. That's it for our string grid example. In closing, yes, a lot to think about. It's the first time we've seen string grids. Practice it. I assure you, you do this example 3 times, and if you really want to make sure you know it, do it on a piece of paper with a pen. That's better for your memory than typing it out. Of course, try it in Delphi, make sure that your code is working, but do it on a piece of paper as well. 3 times, it's going to be in your head. Combine this with what we learned in the first video with 2D arrays, and it's going to be free marks in the exam.